During the Second World War, tanks became the symbol of modern combat. Thundering steel colossi rolled across the battlefields from the scorching sand dunes of the North African desert, through the boggy Norman meadows, to the frozen plains of the Eastern Front. Each such tank was a mobile fortress, a combination of firepower, armor protection, and engine force that armies had not known until then. A turret packed with ammunition and a powerful gun created a sense of unstoppable might. Yet inside this metal giant, a small group of people fought their daily battle, for whom the tank's armor was more a cage than an impregnable stronghold. The life of a tank commander and the entire crew was by no means as heroic or simple as films or wartime propaganda might suggest. How harsh was the reality for these soldiers locked in a steel shell on tracks? What extreme conditions they had to endure, and what dangers lurked at every corner of a ruined city or the edge of a forest. That is what we will examine today. In this video, you will learn what the everyday life of tank commanders looked like during the Second World War. From brutal training and a first baptism of fire, through the stifling heat inside a baking tank, to freezing nights when the crews were shaken by cold as much as by fear. We will peer into the cramped bowels of various tanks and show what torments soldiers had to cope with, whether they commanded the legendary Soviet T-34, the American Sherman, or a German Panzer. Dramatic stories await us, full of courage, but also despair. We will see, for example, how crews dealt with searing heat, deafening noise, and the constant danger of burning alive. In a moment, we will reveal how a young tanker's first battle unfolded, and why for many their illusions of an easy victory collapsed within the very first minutes at the front. Prepare for an unvarnished look at the lives of people who day after day risked their lives in steel coffins while shells rained down outside and fresh air ran out inside. But before a tank commander ever found himself on the battlefield, he had to go through a hard path of training. In the early years of the war, romantic notions often prevailed among young recruits. The tank forces were attractive for their image as the elite knights of modernity. Memoirs of veterans describe how 17- and 18-year-old boys enlisted in the tank arm, dreaming of adventure and quick glory. Army posters lured them with images of important crews racing toward the enemy, protected by powerful armor. Few of them guessed what this service really entailed, yet already during training, a brutal sobering awaited them. Tanker training was harsh and intensive. Future tank commanders had to learn not only to drive a tens-of-tons monster over varied terrain, but also to understand the complex mechanics of engines, guns, and radios. They learned to coordinate their 4- or 5-man crews, driver, gunner, loader, and possibly radio operator or machine gunner, so that each man knew exactly what to do. In this video, you will see that good crew cohesion was a matter of survival. Only a well-drilled team had a chance to react instantly to sudden threats, so training included endless rehearsals of reporting, laying on target, loading the gun, or fixing a breakdown under time pressure. For example, British instructors in the African desert forced novices to change a tank's track repeatedly in the middle of the day, under the full blaze of the sun, to prepare them for the realities of combat conditions. It was exhausting work, lifting heavy track links, wrestling a jack in sand, and all of it in a hurry, because in real combat, a stationary tank would be easy prey. No young candidate for the tank arm came away from such trials thinking a stroll awaited him rather than a fight for bare life. While Americans and Britons could afford relatively long training for their tankers in the rear, at places like Britain's Bovington Camp or America's Fort Knox, tank crew preparation took several months, including live fire and simulated maneuvers. In the Red Army, there was often no time for that, especially in 1941 when the Soviet Union suffered enormous losses. Many new tank commanders were literally thrown into battle after a shortened course. Young Soviet tankers often went to the front with minimal experience. They had learned to drive and shoot, but lacked tactics and, above all, practice. One veteran of the Eastern Front recalled that when he arrived at his unit, he received a quick briefing from an experienced comrade. Stick with the veterans, learn from them, and just survive the first week. Then you have a chance. The first week in combat was critical for a newcomer. Statistically speaking, if he survived the first few engagements, his chances of living longer rose because he learned the necessary tricks and acquired proper caution. But many never got through those first few days. In a moment, we will reveal one of the reasons. The first combat deployment often meant a shock that swept away all the lessons learned on the training ground. When the day finally came for a commander to lead his crew into battle, you could cut the tension with a knife. Imagine the moment. Somewhere in France, a few days after the Allied landings in Normandy in 1944, 4 Shermans stand by a country lane ready to attack. In one of them, nicknamed, say, Alice after a pin-up girl painted on the turret, sits a 19-year-old British commander recently attached to a veteran unit. He has barely slept all night. In the morning, he tried to breakfast on tinned beans and a mug of tea, but his throat was dry. Now, shortly after dawn, he awaits the order to move. He knows that somewhere beyond that French village lurk German anti-tank guns and possibly even fearsome tigers. His heart hammers and his head swarms with thoughts. Am I ready? Will I mess up? Can I protect my men? He recalls the veteran's warning that in this role, rookies were given a life expectancy of only 2 weeks. That's how one of the Sherwood Rangers veterans who fought in Normandy put it. According to Captain David Render's recollections, a new tank subaltern was not expected to last more than 14 days before being killed in action. No wonder the old hands looked at the youngsters with a mix of cynicism and pity. See you in a few days. Or maybe not, they would say bitterly. Our young commander swallows hard and puts on his black beret. He doesn't wear a steel helmet. Most tankers fought in cloth berets because a helmet got in the way at the site, and they believed that if a hit came, the helmet wouldn't save them anyway. The radio screeches, and an order comes into the headphones. Advance! He raises his hand. The machine shudders and clatters forward. Now there is no turning back. The first clash usually decided a crew's fate. Often it was sheer chaos. Despite the training, much happened in ways no one expected. Soldiers describe how, as soon as their tank came under enemy fire, all plans went up in smoke. In a moment, we'll plunge into that very turmoil. The moments when a commander first saw an enemy vehicle in his sight, or when a blow sounded and the armor of their own tank took a crushing hit. A commander's very first combat experience was a brutal awakening. Those who survived remembered it for life. Many veterans unanimously describe a mixture of horror and astonishment when first coming face to face with the foe. For example, a German tank officer recalled his first action on the Eastern Front. Only when I saw Soviet tanks and heard the whistling of anti-tank rounds did it hit me that this wasn't an exercise. My heart skipped several beats in amazement, and then it became a fight for life. The tank commander first had to overcome his own fear and confusion and make decisions in seconds. Through a sight or a vision slit, he saw only a narrow sector of reality. Shots crashed all around, and the earth shuddered with explosions. The first hit, whether theirs or the enemy's, was shocking. Picture the scene through the eyes of a British tanker in Normandy. Sherman Alice is charging forward along a hedgerow when, bang, a sharp blow shakes the entire tank, An explosion throws up a cloud of dust. "Hit!" the gunner shouts, but it's unclear who hit whom. Our commander, in confusion, pops his head out of the hatch to see where it came from. He knows he's risking it. Half his body is now protruding from the turret. But inside a buttoned-up tank, you can't see a thing, and a commander must see. He notices a burning tank stump nearby and, with horror, recognizes one of the Shermans from his troop. A few meters farther, in the bushes, he spots the silhouette of a German Panzer IV with a long barrel. He immediately ducks back into the turret and yells into the intercom, "Enemy right! 100 meters! Fire!" His gunner swings the turret. The loader flashes around into the breach. "Up! Fire!" The shot slams into the German tank's side. It halts and smoke begins to rise. The British crew's elation doesn't last a second. Boom! A second enemy tank, hitherto concealed, fires. The round punches through the Sherman's glacis. For a heartbeat, the turret erupts in blinding light and a rain of fragments. Our commander feels a dull blow to his shoulder and is stunned, but alive. The armor slowed the round, and it passed close by him. The loader had it worse, standing right on the projectile's path inside the turret. A scream, blood on the walls. The commander comes to from a brief blackout and hears the desperate voice of the company commander in his headphones. "Alice, you're on fire! Out, out!" Only now does he realize smoke and flames are spreading inside the tank. The hit ignited stored ammunition. "Out of the tank! Out!" he shouts, scrambling up the hatch. He feels someone pushing from below. The gunner braces his shoulders under the commander's boots and heaves him out. It's a drilled evacuation procedure they had practiced beforehand. The commander vaults from the hatch and falls on his back beside the tank. He springs up at once and reaches a hand to the gunner climbing after him, soot black and gasping from the smoke. The driver and radio operator crawl from the front hatches. All are coughing, but alive. Only the loader does not appear. The tank is engulfed in flames and bullets whistle around. Enemy infantry are raking the fleeing crew with automatic fire. The commander shouts to the others, "Down and away! Away from the tank!" They roll into the wheat at the field's edge and crawl as far as possible from the burning Sherman, which may explode any moment. In a few minutes, the 5 have become 4. Only their lightning exit spared them from turning to ash with Alice. Scenes like this played out on every front where tanks fought. According to U.S. statistics from 1944, in high-intensity fighting in Europe, the average survival time of a tank in active contact before being knocked out was only about 15 minutes. Of course, not every hit ended in tragedy. Sometimes the vehicle could be repaired, or the crew escaped unhurt. But the grim reality was that in a furious duel, tank versus tank or tank versus gun, everything came down to seconds and luck. A commander who had entered battle with a plan and clear orders often found himself, minutes later, dealing with a completely different problem. How to get his men alive off a burning island of steel. How to reorient after the unit was scattered. Or how to break contact under fire. One American tanker, Sergeant Oda Miller of the 32nd Armored Regiment, described a moment when their Sherman was hit. The shell struck the turret right by the hatch. It tore half the commander's head off, and his limp body collapsed in on top of me. I was sprayed all over with blood. It was like the worst nightmare, but I had to keep functioning. This horrific testimony shows what soldiers faced inside the cramped steel fortress. The tank commander might be in charge of the machine, but the reality of battle could snatch all control from his hands in a heartbeat. After a baptism of fire, if the commander survived, endless days of service awaited. Battles did not rage continuously. Crews spent far more time on moves, waiting, maintenance, and preparation. But even out of direct combat, life in a tank unit was full of discomfort and stress. In a moment, we will look at what a typical day looked like behind the front and on the march, and why they often said that battle was far from the only hell they had to endure. The first thing that comes to mind is the environment inside the tank. The turret and hull were incredibly cramped. On paper, a crew numbered 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, machine gunner, or in some armies 4, when one man doubled roles. But cramming 5 grown men in battle gear into such a tight space was difficult in itself. The commander had his position up in the turret under the hatch. The gunner and loader were beside the gun. The driver and another crewman sat forward in the hull. Every centimeter of space was used. Ammunition bins, fuel tanks, the engine occupying the rear of the hull. The transmission, radio, instruments, and control levers lay all around them. The crew were literally pressed against one another. It was not uncommon for the commander, when the turret traversed, to pin someone, or for the men to get in each other's way while loading the gun. And that's with the tank in motion, bouncing over ruts and launching off bumps. Inside, men bashed against metal walls and fittings, collided with each other, and often had bodies mottled with bruises. There was usually no padding or sprung seating, perhaps a thin leather cover on some types. Every cross-country drive became torture for spine and nerves. Add to that the noise. The engine thundered barely a few dozen centimeters behind the crew's backs, especially in American M4 Shermans with the Continental Radial Aircraft engine. The noise was deafening. The motor roared at full tilt with a high-pitched whine. Gears screeched when the turret turned. When the main gun fired, the whole structure rang like a bell. A gunshot inside was a real shock to the ears. Crews wore simple leather or cloth helmets, and sometimes the intercom's muffling headsets. But that was far from enough. The constant noise of engine, tracks, transmission, and the periodic concussions of firing meant many tankers suffered hearing loss. At times, they literally had to shout orders at one another to be heard, even at arm's length. Another enemy inside was the air, or rather, the lack and the quality of it. Tanks had no air conditioning and only primitive filtration. In combat, hatches were usually to be kept shut, under shelling or where snipers might be about. So the crew relied only on small fans or vents. Older tanks also lacked the device called a bore evacuator that would draw propellant fumes out of the barrel after firing. This meant every time the gun fired, a cloud of smoke from the burnt propellant charge billowed into the fighting compartment. The combustion products contained carbon monoxide and other toxic gases that, in high concentrations, caused weakness up to poisoning. Unsurprisingly, a closed tank quickly filled with acrid fumes under intense firing, making eyes water and men nauseated. A Russian tanker, Vladimir Sergeyevich Severinov, described a battle at Kursk in the summer of 1943. Being inside a tank in July 1943 was like sitting in a heated oven full of poisonous gases and suffocating. In his memoir, he noted that in one engagement in a T-34, their loader, and then even the driver, passed out during the firing, simply blacked out from heat and fumes. The tank began to run out of control because the unconscious driver's foot slipped off the pedal and the machine rolled forward. The commander had to crack his hatch for a few seconds to let in some fresh air, or they would all have suffocated. But opening a hatch in the middle of a battle meant risking instant death. Enemy infantry were firing at the tank, and the commander heard rounds striking the armor. Even so, he did it. A few gulps of air brought the driver around just enough to hit the brake. The crew narrowly avoided a crash and perhaps a hit, but all were at the breaking point. This episode clearly shows the extreme conditions inside a tank. The combination of heat, toxic fumes, lack of oxygen, and stress could literally bring a man down without a single bullet touching him. On top of the bad air came ordinary smells and filth. In the closed space, the stench of burnt fuel, oil, and lubricants mixed with human sweat. Crews often had no chance to wash properly for days. Interiors were smeared with oil, grime, and dust. Shells were soot-blackened. When there was time, soldiers, of course, cleaned weapons and inside surfaces, but in combat conditions, it was difficult. Some eyewitnesses say their hands were permanently black, with grime, and faces so dusty that after a few days in action, they were unrecognizable. Personal hygiene took a back seat. Sometimes they at least rinsed face and hands from a canteen, but any real washing was out of the question. All this sapped morale. If a soldier felt dirty and sticky, it was harder to keep mental balance. German tankers, it was said with exaggeration, could be smelled before their tanks. The unique mix of sweat and fumes was unmistakable. No less important was temperature. A tank was like a thermos. It copied the surrounding climate and amplified it. In summer, the metal hull baked in the sun so that inside felt like a greenhouse. At noon in the tropics, temperatures inside could exceed 50 degrees C. Crews overheated, drank water in torrents, yet still suffered heat exhaustion. In motion, fans moved air, but it was hot and dusty. The North African campaign went down in history in this respect. Soldiers of the Africa Corps and the British Eighth Army wrote with one voice that in the dancing dunes of sand, the inside of a tank was perhaps the worst place to be. Dust penetrated everywhere, and the heat sapped strength. According to reports from American Sherman crews, in the desert, they had to stop every 2 to 3 hours to clean the engine air filters because fine sand clogged them. If they didn't, the engine would overheat and seize. This meant that even out of battle, the crew had to tumble out into blistering sun to shake and wash filters, then climb back into the oven and carry on. In the desert, paradoxically, the extreme heat didn't cause mass collapses. The dry air evaporated sweat and cooled a little, but the load on the body was immense. By contrast, in winter the tank turned into an icebox. The brutal winter of 1941-42 on the Eastern Front was seared into every participant's memory. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. German sources indicate that in November 1941, temperatures inside German tanks fell below zero. Crews literally froze inside. Engines iced up and wouldn't start. Soldiers suffered frostbite even with mittens. Hydraulic oil thickened. Rime formed on the floor from the crew's own breath. Soviet tankers were no better off. Their machines, though running on diesel rather than gasoline, less explosive, also gelled in the cold. In the morning, you often had to light a small fire under the engine or pour hot water on the radiator just to get it started. Picture tankers chattering their teeth all night inside. Whenever there was time and fuel, they tried to warm up from engine heat, leaving it idling to radiate a little warmth into the fighting compartment. But fuel was precious, and often this was impossible. They simply shivered, each piling on whatever he had. In the morning, half the crew had hands so numb they could barely feel levers and triggers. In such extremes, work suffered. The loader's stiff fingers struggled to hoist heavy rounds. The driver found it hard to modulate the clutch. The commander had to account for this and somehow motivate his men to endure and keep functioning. Hot or freezing, one thing was common inside a tank: physical exhaustion and sleep deprivation. At the front, tankers rarely got a regular 8 hours of sleep. More often, it was only 3 to 4 hours a day, and in snatches. In battle situations, the rule was to be at readiness before dawn. Tanks moved out early, often around 5 a.m., to use surprise or first light. The commander rose before dawn, grabbed a quick breakfast with his men. Brits and Americans usually managed tea or coffee and something canned. Soviets often only a crust of bread or a hard biscuit washed down with water. Right after, he and his mechanics checked their vehicle. Tracks secure, engine catching, weapons cleaned and loaded. Personal kit was tied in bags outside on the armor. There was no room inside. Then they awaited the order to move and set off. The whole day was usually spent on alert or in action. Hours of concentration. If they weren't shooting at that moment, units shifted to new positions, patrolled or dug tank scrapes to hull down their vehicles. A tank commander often stood waist up in the turret for 12 hours or more, head out of the hatch for visibility, eyes constantly on guard. Any suspicious movement on the horizon could mean the enemy. A tank with hatches closed is a blind monster, the British said. A commander therefore preferred to risk it and watch through a periscope or with his own eyes outside rather than stay shut in and see nothing. But that meant he was in danger every second. The nervous strain from constant observation and unit coordination was enormous. According to military historian James Holland, the tank commander endured the greatest nervous load of all crew members because he bore responsibility and had to maintain continuous situational awareness. A British major, John Semkin, who fought with the Sherwood Rangers Armored Brigade, stated that a tank commander spends most of the day on his feet and on edge, and that it is incredibly exhausting. After such a day, the unit often pulled back in the evening to refuel, rearm, and perform maintenance. But there was still no rest. Work awaited in repairs and cleaning. The crew split tasks after halting. The commander went to an O group, orders group, where all tank commanders gathered around the troop or squadron leader to receive orders for the next day. Meanwhile, his men checked and tightened tracks, torqued running gear bolts, refueled from jerry cans, and topped up engine oil. The loader and helpers hauled heavy shells and ammo from supply trucks to refill the racks. The gunner cleaned the bore of propellant fouling. If the tank had small damage, the fitters tried to fix it overnight, often with some of the crew holding lamps and helping. These evening routines sometimes ran late into the night. When they finally finished, they spread a tarp beside the tank on the ground, or climbed back inside if attack threatened, and tried to sleep. They slept in their clothes, boots on, weapons at hand. An alarm could come at any moment. The men were dirty and soaked in sweat or rain, but from exhaustion often fell asleep within a minute even on cold ground. Sometimes they were lucky, and their unit went into reserve for a few days beyond the enemy's immediate reach. Then they could set a camp, pitch tents, or find shelter in a building. Rare moments to strip out of reeking overalls, shave, wash body and clothes, eat hot food, and maybe write a letter home. Even in the rear, many still heard in their heads the echoes of engines and guns they had lived through. One British commander admitted in his diary, "At night I wake with my hands clenched, as if I'm still gripping the machine gun. I can't shake off the weight." The tank was a fearsome weapon, but it was also target number one for the enemy. A commander's life was cruel in another way. Death could come from anywhere, anytime. The tank's enemies wore many faces, and the crew had to keep eyes open at all times. The commander, as the eyes and ears of his machine, had to detect threats in time and react correctly. What dangers threatened tankers? There were many. The most fearsome opponents were anti-tank guns and other tanks. Guns of 75 mm, 88 cm, or the Soviet 76 mm, Ottomanis 85 mm, could penetrate the armor of most tanks of the time at normal combat ranges. Thus, a tank commander moved across a battlefield where someone was aiming at him with an imaginary sniper rifle of several centimeters caliber. Anti-tank units sought concealment and to fire at short range from cover. One American officer put it neatly: "Tanks can do many things on the battlefield, but one is fatal to them: stopping." If tanks ran into cunningly sighted guns, they could be turned into burning hulks within minutes, without even finding out from where death came. Commanders, therefore, had to constantly scan the terrain: suspicious bushes, hides, woodland edges where a gun barrel might glint. Every tanker feared the black bogeyman named 88, the famous 88 mm Flak 36, the German anti-aircraft, anti-tank gun that the Wehrmacht used against tanks to terrifying effect. Its rounds could pierce virtually any Allied tank at over 2 kilometers. The British spoke of it with respect and dread and tried to destroy it before it destroyed them. But finding a well-camouflaged 88 before it fired was a superhuman task. A British tank commander described an encounter near Nijmegen. "Suddenly, I was blind and deaf. A shot from an 88 hit our tank, and the blast wave robbed me of vision for several minutes. I waited for death, but came to. Later, I learned another tank managed to knock that gun out. I was lucky." Such luck, however, was far from everyone's lot. In tank versus tank duels, a mix of luck, training, and technology decided. Commanders had to know their own machine's strengths and the enemy's. German commanders on the Eastern Front in 1941 were horrified when they first met the Soviet T-34. Its sloped frontal armor shrugged off their 37 mm and 50 mm guns. Suddenly, they faced a tank against which their weapons were almost ineffective, while it could kill them with one shot. The same happened to many Western allies when they ran into heavy Panthers and Tigers. The famous German Tiger I had thick frontal armor and an 88 mm gun that could burn a Sherman or a T-34 at a kilometer or more. Allied tankers felt helpless against Tigers. In Normandy 1944, fortunately, there were relatively few of them. British Captain David Render recalled that only around 130 Tigers were deployed in Normandy, yet they spread panic. "I fired at a Panther from 100 meters, and our shot bounced," another British commander wrote of meeting the modern German Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther. Tankers, therefore, had to devise tactics: ambush, maneuver, shoot at weak spots, flanks, and rear of the enemy tank, and cooperate with other tanks or artillery. Thus, the commander had his hands full, literally shouting orders over the radio to sister tanks, coordinating fire, and designating targets, all under enemy fire. As soon as an enemy tank appeared, a commander became both hunter and prey at once. Who would get whom? In seconds, either he would burn or the enemy. Beyond visible threats, tankers faced hidden dangers. Chief among them were mines. Anti-tank mines were insidious because you usually didn't know about them until it was too late. One pass over a mine, and a deafening blast ripped a track off, wrecked running gear, sometimes even tore out a piece of the floor. In such a case, the crew's life hung by a thread. The driver and radio operator up front near the floor were often severely wounded or killed by the blast, being closest to it. And even if no one died, the tank instantly became immobile, stuck in place like a sitting duck. A fast evacuation followed, because once the enemy noticed a disabled tank, they would fire at it to finish it off. The commander had to judge where minefields might lie, and either bypass them or call in engineers to clear them. But in battle, there was often no time. According to one British statistic, about 8% of tank losses were due to mines, particularly bitter losses, because they put tanks out of action before they could even fight. Another dire threat was infantry armed with anti-tank weapons. Once tanks neared enemy trenches or entered a town, the moment came for bold loners with Panzerfausts, grenades, or Molotov cocktails. A commander dreaded his column threading between houses on a narrow street. Windows and doors could hide men with German Panzerfausts, American bazookas, or, earlier in the war on the Soviet side, anti-tank rifles and bottles of incendiary mixture. Such an enemy would pop up only meters from the tank, fire at point-blank range to pierce even strong armor, or slap on a charge or bomb. In urban fighting tanks were vulnerable. They could not traverse quickly. They had poor sight lines upward to windows, and without their own infantry cover, they could be easily doused in gasoline and set alight. Crews therefore learned to cooperate, and commanders pleaded over the radio for infantry support, without which they feared to enter cities. In the burning streets of Berlin in 1945 or Budapest in 1944, tankers saw true horrors as their steel favorites became fiery traps after attacks by well-hidden infantry. One Soviet tanker described fighting in Berlin. By day we feared to look out of the tank. Behind any window, a German with a Faust patron could be lurking. We fired at windows for good measure and moved slowly. I saw 3 of our tanks on a broad avenue turn into torches in the blink of an eye. Linked to infantry was another nightmarish fear of tank commanders: close combat and infantry swarming the tank. If enemy infantry got close, they might try to climb onto the tank and drop a grenade through a hatch, or simply shoot the crew through vents. In such a situation, tankers often snatched pistols and submachine guns and fired through firing slits to defend themselves. Sometimes they even had to clamber out and fight hand-to-hand, an extreme and desperate measure. Improvised tactics appeared. German tankers, for example, carried gasoline cans on the turret in case enemies tried to board. They would ignite them and pour fire around. In other cases, the tank would circle and rock to shake off a clinging infantryman. In any event, it raised gooseflesh. Again, the commander bore the greatest responsibility. He had to spot the approach in time and either neutralize it with weapons, drive away, or call for help. In the forests of the Ardennes or the Italian mountains, such close encounters were common. A tank without infantry support was simply vulnerable, and every commander knew it. Another danger threatened from above: the air. German crews, especially near the end of the war, spoke of the terror nicknamed Jabos, from Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. Allied aircraft, Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix in the east, or British Typhoons and American Thunderbolts and Mustangs in the west, had by late war achieved air superiority and stalked any German tank column moving by day. A commander had to watch the sky too. When the snarl of an aircraft engine rose and rockets or bombs came streaking down, there was nothing he could do. German units tried to camouflage, hide tanks under trees, stay in cover by day, and move at night. Even so, many tanks were bombed or had to be abandoned due to air attacks. Testimony from German commanders in Normandy indicates a crushing impact on morale. We felt like game on a hunt. When those English Thunderbolts, actually Typhoons, attacked with rockets, there was no escape. Every pass meant a dead tank. Even if the reality was not that one-sided, many rockets missed, the sense of vulnerability was immense. On the other side of the front, in 1941 and 1942, Soviet tankers felt a similar dread at the dive bombers, Stukas, that accompanied German offensives. The wailing sirens of Stukas plunging on tank columns with anti-tank bombs carved themselves into many a soldier's memory. Many admitted that when they heard the Stukas shriek, their stomachs clenched. They knew that in seconds their tank might be blown sky high. One more enemy must be mentioned: breakdowns and accidents. Tanks were complex machines, and breakdowns were very common, especially in harsh conditions. Overstress the engine, and it might overheat or seize. Turn wrong in a bog, and a track could throw. Let a stone wedge into a suspension wheel, and the whole running gear could jam. Thus, a tank commander had to be both tactician and mechanic. When a machine failed, it fell to him to decide what next: fix on the spot, tow back, or in the last resort, destroy the vehicle to keep it from the enemy. Each choice was risky. Repairing under fire was the ultimate gamble, yet it came to that. Sometimes crews behind the lines had to repair a transmission all night, hearing guns rumble in the distance and hoping that at dawn, their own troops, not the enemy, would find them. On the move, accidents happened. A tank overturned into a ditch, a collision in darkness, a tank drowned fording a river. All these made an already hard life even harder. As the soldiers said, sometimes it felt like the whole world stood against them and their tank. There is no doubt that tank crews' minds suffered as much as their bodies. The commander was perhaps in the worst mental position of all, bearing enormous responsibility, forced to make split-second decisions, and to cope with the loss of friends and subordinates. Young commanders often arrived at the front full of zeal and resolve. After a few days of combat, they were hard to recognize. One diary of an American tank lieutenant describes how, in the first week in the Ardennes, his company lost half its tanks, and he himself had to replace 3 tank commanders, friends who had fallen. He wrote, "I don't know if I can order an attack again tomorrow morning. I'm afraid I'll be paralyzed by fear, but I can't show it." This inner struggle played out in many commanders' minds. Outwardly, they had to appear confident, so their crews wouldn't lose trust and morale. Inwardly, they often battled anxiety, stress, and exhaustion. Constant stress was part of the daily routine. As historian James Holland describes it, a tank commander is in continuous tension, especially in battle. Every hour at the front could bring a fatal encounter. Even in moments of seeming calm, say, when tanks were hulled down behind a fold in the ground waiting for orders, the nerves still worked. What if the enemy breaks through on the flank? What if an artilleryman is already laid on us and shells will land here in seconds? Such questions raced in the commander's head. Captain Elmer R. Stabe, who commanded a Sherman with the 610th in the Ardennes, put it, "You never know what you're driving into. There might be a mine, there might be a gun, a tank, or infantry with weapons. You're constantly waiting for the blow." This uncertainty of the next second tormented crews day and night. At dawn, they rejoiced to have survived the night. At dusk, they dreaded the darkness that might bring an ambush. Tankers learned different ways to cope with stress. One was crew cohesion, comradeship, and mutual support. In the tiny space of a tank, a crew quickly became a very close family. 4 or 5 men shared everything: food, water, fears, and joys. The commander, though formally senior, often himself fostered a friendly spirit. Crews gave each other nicknames and joked whenever the situation allowed. Humor was a mental crutch, sometimes black and cynical, sometimes boyish. British tankers were fond of brewing tea even at the most inconvenient moments, now legendary. A story is told that in Italy in 1944, a commander put the infamous kettle on just as Germans began shelling their positions. Instead of panicking, he supposedly shouted over the radio to neighboring tanks, "Lads, if you're coming, make it quick, the tea's on." Paraphrasing the German "We're comin' in wenigen Minuten" he'd caught on the air. This absurd humor helped defuse tension and keep sanity. Another key was discipline and drill. Paradoxically, in crises, the stress dulled under routine. If a crew had rehearsed something 100 times, they did it automatically, even in panic. And that could save lives. British Commander Stan Perry, for example, enforced hard drill in his crew. On any move, he would order a sudden bailout, and all had to exit the tank instantly, regardless of what they were doing. They practiced it in fields and forests, day and night. Perry believed that when their tank took a hit and caught fire, the crew would have trained reflexes and get out in seconds, saving their lives. Indeed, this paid off later when one of his men wrote that, upon being hit, the cycle of actions kicked in almost subconsciously. One man shoved another through the hatch, a third pushed the next, and in a blink, they were out at a safe distance. Such drills instilled confidence that even catastrophe could be survived if each knew his role. It also mattered for the commander's psyche that he could do something concrete for his men, prepare them, organize, give hope that they had a fighting chance. Of course, optimism did not always hold. Loss and death were omnipresent. When a tank beside you was struck, and you saw with your own eyes tongues of flame lash out, it shook even the toughest. Many commanders had good friends in their crews, sometimes friends from civilian life, sometimes brothers. There are known cases of brothers serving in the same unit. Their loss hurt all the more, because you often couldn't even stop and mourn. The battle went on. Veterans' memoirs repeatedly describe a numbing. After too much horror, a man petrified, continued functioning like a machine, but inside felt emptiness. Some called it shell shock or battle fatigue. Tankers experienced similar mental states to infantry. After long periods of combat at the edge of physical endurance, the material fatigue came to the mind. Tremors, nightmares, loss of appetite, apathy, or bursts of rage. Armies handled it differently, sending the man for a brief medical rest or rotating him off the line. In the German army by war's end, there was little room for that. Even utterly exhausted crews often had to climb back into tanks as long as it was possible. In the Red Army, psychological issues were preferred not to be spoken of and were masked as physical ailments or wounds. Thankfully, crew cohesion prevented many breakdowns. Men supported one another. If someone was mentally low, the others buoyed him up. Tank units also possessed a strong sense of pride and duty. Tankers knew they were the Army's elite, entrusted with expensive machines and breakthrough tasks that gave them motivation to endure and not show weakness. They also often felt responsibility toward the infantry they were to support. If we give up now, the foot soldiers out there will have it even worse, they told themselves. This collective spirit, we're all in this together, helped them overcome moments when, alone, a man might have run. It was also important that crews often believed in their machines. Despite all hardships, tankers paradoxically loved their tank as both home and weapon. American and British crews gave their Shermans names and painted them on turrets. Alice, Devil, Vengeance, turning them into team members. Soviets painted slogans like "For Stalin" or "Revenge" to stiffen morale. German Tiger commanders believed in the strength of their armor and often felt invincible, though reality caught up with them too. This technical confidence could steady nerves. While the tank drove and shot, the men inside felt a kind of protective shell compared to the infantry outside. Some veterans even admitted they wouldn't have traded places, preferring a tanker's danger to being a common infantryman. Armor gave a sense of safety, relative though it was. When they sometimes had to flee a knocked-out tank and crawl the battlefield in nothing but their uniforms, they felt naked and vulnerable as never before. A tanker without a tank is like a turtle without a shell, one British soldier said after his machine was destroyed and he had to make his way back on foot. The fates of tank commanders in the Second World War are full of suffering, courage, and tragedy. We have seen that life inside the steel monster was incredibly severe in every way, physically uncomfortable and dangerous, mentally exhausting. Yet these men climbed into their machines day after day and carried out orders, often with courage bordering on heroism. Many did not live to see the war's end. Those who survived bore the consequences, scars on their bodies or memories that woke them from sleep. Their experience was not in vain. After the war, armies drew lessons from those dearly bought experiences. Modern tanks take crew comfort and safety more into account. Better ventilation, heating and cooling, fire suppression systems, and above all, far stronger armor and emergency hatches. Soldiers now train in simulators, study tactics to minimize risk, and the technology is more reliable. Even so, as modern conflicts show, tanker service remains dangerous and demanding, and a modern commander knows his machine can be destroyed by an anti-tank projectile in an instant. Every time we see footage of tanks in combat on television, and sadly, in today's world, we should realize what it is like inside. What does the man at the site live through as he decides whether to fire? How his heart must pound when a blow lands on the armor, or when he hears a cry for help from a neighboring crew. The history of the Second World War left us the stories of many brave tankers, be they famous commanders like the German ace Michael Wittmann, the Soviet fighter Dmitry Lavrinenko, or the American commander Crichton Abrams, or completely unknown heroes whose names we will not read in textbooks. Their common denominator is the willingness to endure in inhuman conditions. The tank forces contributed greatly to the war's outcome. Every Allied advance across France, every breakthrough on the Eastern Front at Kursk or elsewhere was paid for in the blood of the crews inside the tanks. We must not forget that. Today may have pushed classic tank battles into history, but the principle remains. Technology is only as good as the people inside, good and resilient. And the stories of military tank commanders teach us to value peace and safety. It is almost unimaginable what they had to go through, gasping on fumes, enduring heat and cold, overcoming fear so as not to let their comrades down. Anyone who has ever visited a museum and climbed into the cramped interior of a wartime tank may have carried away a tiny sense of how uncomfortable it is, and that's without engines burning or anyone shooting. All the more respect is due to those who knew how to fight and win in that space. Our look at the life of a tank commander in the Second World War comes to a close. It was a time that placed extraordinary demands on ordinary people. Let us hope that present and future generations will not be forced to live through such extremes in their own skin. At the same time, let us not forget the lesson these veterans left us. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to carry on despite fear and suffering. Thank you for staying with me through today's journey into history. If you enjoyed the video and learned something new, I'd be glad if you left a like and shared it with others who might be interested in the topic. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other stories from history. Thanks again for your attention. I'll be happy to see you next time. Goodbye. M.